a world of control and conformity. In this world, reproduction was no longer a matter of natural instinct or personal choice. It had been reduced to a precise, mechanized process, governed by the omnipresent hand of the state. The air was sterile, the streets lined with towering structures that loomed over the citizens like silent sentinels, their surfaces polished to a gleaming perfection that reflected the rigid order of the society they represented. Here, in this meticulously controlled environment, the act of giving birth had become a transaction, a function of the system rather than a deeply personal experience. The concept of natural pregnancy had been eradicated, replaced by a carefully engineered process that ensured every individual was born according to the dictates of the state. At the heart of this society lay the Grand Reproduction Center, a vast and imposing structure that stood at the center of the city, its presence a constant reminder of the power that dictated the lives of its citizens. Within its walls, the process of human creation was carried out with clinical precision, each step dictated by the needs of the state. The people who lived outside the center were not entirely free, for even their existence was shaped by the same rigid framework. Every citizen was assigned a role, a purpose, determined by the algorithms that analyzed their genetic potential and their suitability for the society's grand design. There was no room for deviation, no space for the unpredictable nature of human reproduction. The citizens moved through their lives with a quiet efficiency, their expressions carefully curated to reflect the expectations of the system. There was no emotion, no spontaneity. Only the cold, calculated rhythm of existence. The concept of family had been redefined, stripped of its emotional depth and reduced to a mere function of the state's needs. Children were not born of love but of necessity, their existence dictated by the demands of the system rather than the desires of the individuals involved. The people of this world had long since abandoned the notion of personal choice, for to do so would be to challenge the very foundation of their society. Yet, beneath the surface of this meticulously ordered world, there was an undercurrent of unease. The state's control over reproduction was absolute, but not all citizens accepted it without question. Some, like the protagonist of this tale, found themselves caught between the rigid expectations of the system and the lingering remnants of their own humanity. In this world, where the act of giving birth had been reduced to a function of the state, the question of individuality remained an unspoken but ever-present challenge. And as the story begins, it is this very tension between control and the yearning for autonomy that will shape the course of events to come. The scientist and the unseen burden. Dr. Elara Myles had spent the better part of her life within the confines of the Grand Reproduction Center, her existence dictated by the unrelenting demands of the state. As one of the most esteemed scientists within the institution, she had dedicated herself to the refinement of the artificial gestation process, ensuring that each new life was born in accordance with the society's meticulously designed blueprint. Her work was revered, her name spoken with a mixture of admiration and reverence by her colleagues. Yet, despite the prestige that accompanied her role, Elara could not shake the feeling that something within her was beginning to erode, worn away by the weight of the knowledge she possessed. She had always believed in the purpose of the system, in the necessity of its control over human reproduction. The state had long since eradicated the unpredictability of natural birth, replacing it with a process that ensured every individual was born with a purpose, a role that would serve the greater good. It was a system of order, of efficiency, and of stability. And yet, as the years passed, a quiet unease had taken root within her. The more she studied the process, the more she questioned the morality of it. The more she observed the people who passed through the center, those who were assigned to be gestators, those who were merely vessels for the state's will, the more she felt the weight of an invisible burden pressing upon her. Elara had always prided herself on her ability to remain detached, to view her work with the cold, clinical precision that the system demanded. But there were moments, fleeting and rare, when she found herself wondering if the system was not as perfect as it claimed to be. She had seen the way the gestators moved through their assigned roles, their faces blank, their eyes devoid of emotion. She had watched as the artificial gestation chambers hummed with an eerie quiet, their mechanisms working in unison to produce the next generation of citizens. And she had felt the growing sense that something was missing, something uponified or measured by the algorithms that dictated the course of their lives. It was not that she wished to change the system. She had no desire to see chaos return, to witness the unpredictability of natural birth once more. But she could not ignore the feeling that something within her was beginning to shift, that the very foundation of her beliefs was being tested. And as the days passed, as the weight of her knowledge grew heavier upon her, she found herself standing at the precipice of a decision that she had long avoided. For the first time in her life, she was beginning to question whether the system she had served for so long was truly the right one. The mechanism of creation. The process of artificial gestation was a marvel of science, a seamless fusion of biology and technology that had eliminated technologies that the anthrozippus of a decision that she had long avoided. For the first time in her life, she was beginning to question whether the system she had served for so long was truly the right one. The unpredictability of natural reproduction. Within the sterile confines of the Grand Reproduction Center, the gestators, those selected for the purpose of bearing children, were not mere vessels, but carefully engineered participants in the state's grand design. Each gestator was assigned a role based on genetic compatibility, ensuring that the offspring produced would conform to the precise specifications required by the system. Their bodies were monitored with relentless precision, their hormonal fluctuations and physical conditions tracked in real time by the omnipresent surveillance that pervaded every aspect of their existence. The gestators were never given a choice in the matter. They were not asked if they wished to carry a child, nor were they allowed to refuse the assignment. Their bodies were prepared in advance, their reproductive systems altered to accommodate the artificial gestation process. The act of conception was no longer a matter of intimacy or chance, but a carefully orchestrated event dictated by the needs of the state. The genetic material of the future child was selected with meticulous care, chosen to ensure that the offspring would serve the society's purpose with unwavering efficiency. There was no room for deviation, no space for the unpredictable nature of human reproduction. For the protagonist, the experience of carrying a child was a deeply unsettling one. She had been assigned to the process with the same inevitability as all others, her role determined by the algorithms that had long since stripped the act of reproduction of its emotional weight. The artificial gestation chambers were a constant presence in her life, their cold metallic surfaces a reminder of the mechanical nature of her task. The process was not painful, not in the way that natural birth could be, but was suffocating in its clinical precision. She could feel the child growing within her, a presence that was neither entirely her own nor entirely alien. It was a life being created not through the natural course of human biology, but through the calculated will of the state. The expectations placed upon her were immense. She was not merely a gestator, she was a vessel for the future, a link in the unbroken chain of the system's design. Every aspect of her life was dictated by the needs of the child she carried, from the food she consumed to the hours she spent in the artificial gestation chambers. She was not allowed to make decisions for herself, for the child's well-being was paramount. And yet, despite the state's insistence on control, there, hoping, and the unbroken chain of the system's design, every aspect of her life was dictated by the needs of the child she carried, from the food she consumed to the hours she spent in the artificial gestation chambers. Was a quiet desperation within her, an unspoken longing for something beyond the rigid framework of the system. As the weeks passed, the weight of her burden grew heavier. The child within her was not a product of love or desire, but of necessity, a life that had been created not for the sake of individuality, but for the sake of the system's continued existence. She was not allowed to feel anything beyond the prescribed emotions, to experience anything beyond the carefully measured parameters of the state's design. And yet, despite the system's efforts to suppress her autonomy, there was something within her that refused to be silenced. She was not alone in her struggle. There were others who felt the same quiet unease, who found themselves questioning the morality of the process that had been thrust upon them. But to speak of such thoughts was to invite the wrath of the state, to challenge the very foundation of the society they had been raised to serve. And so, they remained silent, their doubts buried beneath the weight of the system's unyielding control. For the protagonist, the journey of carrying a child was not merely a physical one, but an emotional and psychological one as well. It was a journey that would test the limits of her endurance, that would force her to confront the very nature of her existence. And as the final weeks of the gestation process approached, she found herself standing at the precipice of a decision that would shape the course of her life, and perhaps the fate of the system itself: the dehumanization of reproduction. The mechanization of reproduction had stripped away the very essence of what it meant to be human. In the past, the act of giving birth had been an intimate, deeply personal experience, a connection between two individuals that was as much about love and desire as it was about the creation of new life. Now, that connection had been severed, replaced by a cold, clinical process that reduced the act of bearing a child to a mere function of the state's design. The gestators were not mothers, nor were they fathers. They were vessels, their bodies used with the same efficiency as any other tool within the system. And the children they carried were not born of love, but of necessity, their existence dictated by the algorithms that determine the needs of the society. This mechanization had not only dehumanized the gestators, but had also eroded the very fabric of human relationships. In a world where reproduction was no longer a matter of personal choice, the concept of family had been redefined, stripped of its emotional depth, and reduced to a mere function of the state's needs. There was no room for the unpredictability of human connection, no space for the bonds that once formed between parents and children. Instead, the children were assigned to their roles before they were even born, their future predetermined by the calculations of the system. The notion of individuality had been all but erased, replaced by a rigid hierarchy that dictated the purpose of each person from the moment of their conception. The loss of individuality was perhaps the most profound consequence of the mechanization of reproduction. In a society where every citizen was assigned a role based on the reacher predetermined by the calculations of the system, the notion of individuality had been all but erased, replaced by a rigid hierarchy that dictated the purpose of each person. Their genetic potential, there was no room for deviation, no space for the unpredictable nature of human existence. The people of this world had long since abandoned the notion of personal choice, for to do so would be to challenge the very foundation of their society. And yet, despite the state's insistence on control, there was a quiet unease that had taken root within the hearts of many, a feeling that something was missing, that the very essence of what it meant to be human had been lost in the pursuit of order. The ethical implications of this system were vast and far-reaching. The reduction of reproduction to a mere function of the state's needs had not only dehumanized the gestators, but had also created a society that was devoid of the emotional depth that once defined human existence. That the very essence of what it meant to be human had been lost in the pursuit of order. The ethical implications of this system were vast and far-reaching. The children born within this system were not raised with love or care, but with the cold, calculated precision of the algorithms that dictated their future. They were not given the chance to explore their own desires or to forge their own paths, for the system had already decided their purpose before they had even been born. And yet, despite the state's insistence on control, there was a quiet resistance that had begun to take root within the hearts of many, a growing awareness that the system they had been raised to serve was not as perfect as it claimed to be. This resistance was not born of rebellion, but of a deep, unspoken longing for something beyond the rigid framework of the system. It was a longing for the unpredictability of life, for the emotional depth that had begun to take root within the hearts of many, a growing awareness that the system they had been raised to serve was not as perfect as it claimed to be, once defined human existence. It was a longing for the freedom to choose, for the right to create a life not dictated by the algorithms of the state, but by the desires of the individual. And as the protagonist stood at the precipice of the final stages of her gestation, she found herself questioning whether the system she had served for so long was truly the right one. The mechanization of reproduction had not only stripped away the emotional depth of human existence, but it also created a society that was devoid of the very qualities that made life worth living. And yet, despite the state's insistence on control, there was a quiet hope that had begun to take root within the hearts of those who had long since been silenced. It was a hope that, even in the face of the system's unyielding control, there was still a chance for something different, for a future that was not dictated by the algorithms of the state, but by the desires of the individual, the breaking point. The moment of decision came not as a sudden revelation, but as a slow unraveling, a quiet erosion of the beliefs that had once held her together. It was not the system itself that had finally pushed her to the edge, but the realization that she had spent so many years serving a mechanism that had no place for the very essence of what it meant to be human. The artificial gestation process had been a marvel of science, a testament to the power of human ingenuity. Yet, as she stood before the final stages of the gestation chamber, the weight of the child within her was no longer a burden, but a question that she could no longer ignore. She had always believed that the system was necessary, that the control over reproduction was a means of ensuring stability, of preventing the chaos that had once plagued the world. But now, as she looked into the cold, sterile walls of the chamber, she saw not a structure of order, but a prison that had long since stripped away the very thing that made life worth living. The children born within this system were not raised with love or care, but with the cold, calculated precision of the algorithms that dictated their future. They were not given the chance to explore their own desires, to forge their own paths, for the system had already decided their purpose before they had even been born. And yet, despite the system's insistence on control, there was a quiet resistance that had begun to take root within her. It was not born of rebellion, but of a deep, unspoken longing for something beyond the rigid framework of the state. She had spent so many years serving the system, believing that the control over reproduction was the only way to ensure the survival of the society. But now, as she stood at the precipice of the final stages of her gestation, she found herself questioning whether the system she had served for so long was truly the right one. The moment of action came not with a grand declaration, but with a quiet defiance that had been building within her for years. She had long known the risks, the consequences of challenging the system. To question the state was to invite the wrath of the authorities, to risk everything she had ever known. But for the first time in her life, she was no longer afraid. She had spent too many years living in the shadow of the system, allowing it to dictate the course of her existence. Now she would take control of her own fate, even if it meant standing against the very foundation of the society she had once believed in. She did not know what would come next, but she knew that she could no longer remain silent. The system had taken everything from her, from the people around her, from the very fabric of human existence. But she had not been broken. She had been shaped by the system, yes, but she had also been shaped by the system, yes. Quiet resistance that had taken root within her. And as she stepped away from the gestation chamber, she knew that she was no longer just a vessel for the state's will. She was something else now, something that could not be controlled, something that could not be predicted. The system would not allow her to go unchecked. The authorities would come for her, as they had come for so many others who had dared to question the state's control. But she was not afraid. She had spent too many years living in the shadow of the system, allowing it to dictate the course of her existence, Now, she would take control of her own fate, even if it meant standing against the very foundation of the society she had once believed in. And as the first steps of her, they copy not many years living in the shadow of the state's will. She was not afraid. She had spent too many years. The Dubaus. Rebellion began. She knew that she was no longer just a part of the system. She was something else now, something that could not be controlled, something that could not be predicted. And with that knowledge, she stepped forward, ready to face whatever came next. The aftermath of defiance, the rebellion did not come as a single, decisive moment, but as a slow unraveling, a quiet resistance that had taken root in the hearts of those who had long since been silenced. The protagonist's defiance had not been an isolated act, but the first in a chain of events that would reshape the very fabric of the society she had once served. At first, the authorities had tried to suppress the movement, to crush the growing unrest before it could take hold. But the system had always been built on. The system had held its stake and root in the hearts of those who had long since been silenced. The protagonist's defiance had not been an isolated act. Control, not on the ability to resist. And as the people began to question the state's grip on their lives, the cracks in the foundation of the society began to widen. The first signs of change were subtle, almost imperceptible. A few individuals had begun to speak out, to question the system that had dictated their existence for so long. At first, they were met with silence, with the cold, unyielding gaze of the state. But as more people joined their cause, as the quiet resistance grew into something more tangible, the authorities found themselves facing a challenge they had never anticipated. The system had always been built on the assumption that the people would remain obedient, that the rigid structure of control would be enough to ensure stability. But now, that assumption was being tested. The grand finds of the state, with the abose trines of both the intangible, the authorities found themselves facing a challenge they had never anticipated. Reproduction Center, once a symbol of the state's unyielding control, became the first battleground of the rebellion. The gestators, who had long been bound by the system's demands, began to question their roles, to refuse the assignments that had dictated their lives for so long. Some fled into the shadows, disappearing into the uncharted regions of the world that the state had long since abandoned. Others remained, but they no longer carried the children as they once had. They refused to be vessels for the state's will, to be mere tools in the grand design that had been imposed upon them. The authorities responded with swift and brutal force, sending enforcers to quell the growing unrest. But the system had always relied on control, not on the ability to suppress. And as the people began to resist, the state found itself facing a reality it had long since denied. The rebellion was not a singular act of defiance, but a movement that had taken root in the hearts of the people. It was not a matter of whether the system could be stopped, but of whether it could be changed. The protagonist, now a symbol of the resistance, had disappeared from the public eye, her fate unknown. Some believed she had been captured, taken by the authorities for her defiance. Others believed she had escaped, vanishing into the depths of the world beyond the city's walls. But regardless of her fate, her actions had set something in motion that could not be undone. The system had always been built on the assumption that the people would remain obedient, that the rigid structure of control would be enough to Freimasching, dort Trimastructure, taken by the authorities for her defiance. In Ascetas, they plashed, their Trimashing into the depths of the world beyond the city's walls. But regardless of her fate, her actions had set something in motion that could not be undone. Ensure stability. But now, that assumption was being tested. The society that had once been so tightly controlled was beginning to change, though not without resistance. The state still held power, still dictated the course of lives with the cold precision of its algorithms. But the people had begun to question the system, to challenge the very foundation of their existence. And as the rebellion continued to grow, the question remained, could the system survive, or had it already begun to fall? The paradox of control and autonomy. In the end, the story of the protagonist and the society she had once served was not one of absolute victory or total defeat, but of a delicate, unresolved tension between control and autonomy. The rebellion continued to grow. The question remained. The question remained, could the system survive, or had it already begun to fall? The paradox of control and autonomy had governed the lives of its citizens for so long. Instead, it had exposed the cracks in the foundation, the unspoken contradictions that had always existed beneath the surface of the society's carefully constructed order, the mechanization of reproduction, the erasure of individuality, the cold precision of the state's algorithms. These had all been built on the assumption that control was the only path to stability. Yet, as the protagonist had discovered, and as the people had begun to realize, control was not the same as freedom. It was not the same as the right to choose, to create, to live as one saw fit. The act of giving birth, once a deeply personal and intimate experience, had been stripped of its meaning, reduced to a function of the system's needs. The gestators, the children, the entire society had been shaped by the algorithms that dictated their roles, their purposes, their very existence. And yet, despite the system's insistence on control, there had always been a quiet resistance, a longing for something beyond the rigid framework of the state. The protagonist had been one of the first to question the system, to challenge the assumptions that had long gone unchallenged, and in doing so, she had set something in motion that could not be undone. But the question remained, had the rebellion changed the system, or had it merely revealed the flaws that had always been present? The state had not been overthrown, nor had its control been entirely dismantled. It had merely been forced to confront the growing resistance that had taken root within the hearts of the people. The authorities had responded with force, with the cold precision of their algorithms, but they had also been forced to acknowledge that the people were no longer willing to remain silent. The system had always been built on the assumption that the people would remain obedient, that the rigid structures of control would be enough to ensure stability. But now, that assumption was being tested and the results were uncertain. The story of the protagonist was not just a tale of defiance, but of the enduring human need for connection, for meaning, for the right to choose one's own path. The system had tried to erase individuality, to replace the unpredictability of human existence with the cold, calculated precision of its algorithms, but in doing so, it had overlooked the very thing that made life worth living: the ability to choose, to create, to love. The protagonist had not been the first to question the system, nor would she be the last. And as the rebellion continued to grow, as the people began to challenge the very foundation of the society they had been raised to serve, the question remained: could the system survive, or had it already begun to fall? The answer was not clear, and perhaps it never would be, but the story had been told, and with it, the possibility of something different had been set in motion. The protagonist had not changed the world in a single moment, but she had shown that even in the face of the system's unyielding control, there was still a chance for something else, for a future that was not dictated by the algorithms of the state, but by the desires of the individual. And in that there was hope. Hope! Do not forget to hit the like button and subscribe for more stories. Hit the notification bell to be notified of new stories when they become available. Feel free to leave a comment and tell me if you enjoyed the story and want to hear more like it.